Well, look, I think it's prudent that states take decisions to slow down the reopening as they have a surge in cases. Nashville has an uptick in cases. Tennessee's never really had a decline in cases. If you look at the trend line for Tennessee since really March, they've had a slow increase in cases. They never had a surge in cases, never had a very large number of cases, but it's been slowly creeping up. And that's like a lot of other parts of this country. We're accustomed to looking at the states that had epidemics where they had a lot of cases and they've come down their epidemic curve. But there's a lot of parts of the country that have had this slow burn of cases. They've had consistent infections all the way through. Maybe the cases dropped off a little bit, but now they're picking back up. And there's a lot of states like that. Tennessee is sort of in that bucket. We always expected that as we reopen, cases would bounce back up. But for a lot of states, they're bouncing back up off a baseline of spread that was there all along.
You tweeted a little bit earlier tonight, I noticed, nationally the positivity rate is flat. But as you mentioned, there are hot spots we need to keep an eye on. Arizona, for example, is seeing 80% of its ICU beds now taken. Florida cases are increasing by 1,000 per day. We know what's happening in Texas. How concerned are you, Dr. Gottlieb, about these hot spots we're seeing?
It's concerning. What I put out on Twitter tonight was a 7-day rolling average, and the average doesn't really show a sharp uptick. There's a slight trend towards up in the last few days, but the positivity rate nationally is about flat, about where it was, around 5%, and we're still accruing about 20,000 or so new cases a day nationally. Part of that's driven by the fact the Northeast is coming down while other parts of the country go up. So parts of the country that haven't been affected by this are starting to see increases as the parts of the country that were hard hit continue to come down their curves. But you look at Arizona with 1,200 cases new day and a rising positivity rate of 15%, Texas with 1,600 cases a day and 7% positivity rate. South Carolina also looks very concerning, about 500 cases a day, which is a lot in a small state, but a positivity rate of 11%. Watching these positivity rates go up is what's concerning. It's not just a function of more testing that we're seeing more cases get turned over. They're actually reporting a higher percentage of the cases that they test as being positive. And so that's another concerning trend. So there are parts of the country that are experiencing what would constitute an outbreak right now. We have more testing in place, so hopefully it doesn't get out of control. But the concerning thing about these states is they really haven't isolated the source of the outbreak. Even Tennessee, they haven't isolated it to a facility or a certain set of activities. And so it might end up being that it's emanating from certain places, but they don't know that yet. And that's what's going to frustrate their ability to take decisive action.
If you're the governor tonight of either Texas or Arizona or South Carolina, your advice would be what?
Implement good tracing. I mean, there's a lot of pushback in certain quarters to track and trace because people feel that there'll be so much infection that it's going to be the government, tracking down every individual and tapping them on the shoulder and telling them they have to self-isolate or go get tested, and they'll be intrusive. So people see it as an intrusion into individual liberty. And so there's a lot of pushback in certain states, including Texas, where there's an organized effort against the public health interventions of track and trace. But it's not just tracking and tracing isn't just to find individuals. It's to find settings where infection is spreading. And that's how we determine that homeless shelters were a source of spread, and nursing homes. We were able to trace infections back to those places, and also certain settings of employment. We found warehouses and other places that ended up being the sources of outbreaks in communities because we were able to trace infection back to those establishments. And that's why you want to have those good public health tools in place. The governors should be really investing in that.
I'm glad you talked about spread. I mean, this issue of asymptomatic spread, it's been hot in the news, obviously, this week. First, we thought yes, then the World Health Organization sort of muddied the waters on that and said that was very rare. Now it appears that we're back to, yes, there is a sizable amount of asymptomatic spread. Can you clarify where we stand tonight?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, there's a lot of data on this now. The question is, are people who are asymptomatic as contagious as people who are symptomatic? And the answer to that is we don't know for sure. But what we do know from pretty good studies is that the period in which you're shedding the most virus is when you're pre-symptomatic. And so it's 0.7 days before you develop symptoms is your peak infectivity on average. And so people who get COVID are most infectious right before they develop symptoms. Now, you can argue that people who are pre-symptomatic are effectively asymptomatic, but that's not quite right. The people who are truly asymptomatic are people who develop the COVID infection and never develop symptoms. We think those people are still infectious. In fact, we're pretty confident they are. They might be less infectious than the people who are pre-symptomatic, meaning that they aren't symptomatic yet, but they're going to go on to develop symptoms. Those individuals we know for sure are contagious before they develop symptoms, and maybe most contagious before they develop symptoms, which is what makes this a nasty infection. In a lot of other viruses, you're most symptomatic when you're sick, so you're less efficient at spreading it because since you're sick, you're more likely to be in bed or self-identify as being infectious and take precautions not to spread it. With this virus, you're most infectious on the whole right before you develop those symptoms.